Hello everyone, how's it going? This is Matt Carney, EdTech 6440. I'm going to be doing my final presentation, and it's called Grid Vates. It's a web app that's a dynamic line rating educational sandbox. So the agenda for today's presentation, going to provide some background, some motivation to why I built it, a demo, and then also some future work. Okay, when we talk about lines here, we're talking about transmission lines that convey energy, and when we talk about rating, we're talking about the ampacity or the maximum amount of current that can go through transmission lines. And so, at a very, very high level, grid operators, they're always trying to balance, supply and demand for energy, very dynamic system. There's also a lot of, safety concerns that need to be considered. And it's kind of outside the scope of this project, but for transmission lines, the thermal limits really drive that capacity. And so that can be for, it's kind of two parts to that. One is the maximum sag. So as a transmission line heats up, it sags and can become in contact with an object. And the other one is just more from like a material science perspective. It's just the maximum conductor temperature, and that's what we're going to be focusing on for the calculations and the methodology today. Okay, so the rating is calculated from the IEEE standard 738/2006 steady state heat balance. So the current is, it's a function of the convected heat loss per unit length, radiated heat loss per unit length, heat gain from the sun, and the AC resistance of the conductor temperature at time t. You don't need to remember all this. What's important to hear is that environmental conditions such as ambient temperature, wind speed, and wind direction, and solar irradiance impact the line rating, right? So if you think about this, right, if you have two different transmission lines, one's and everything else is considered is the same, and you have one that's in a hot climate and one that's in a cold climate, that cold climate is going to provide additional cooling relative to the hot climate, and so you can actually push more current through that line. The question is how do you calculate the values or the thresholds for those different environmental conditions? And so there's three main approaches. One is static. So this is sort of a old school or sort of a little bit outdated way of approach where you're looking at seasonal or annual historical worst case conditions. And I say it's outdated, but it's a conservative approach. But at the same time, you're missing out on the instances when the environment isn't at that worst case situation, and you could be potentially pushing more current. So then we move into ambient adjusted, right? So in this situation, you're using more granular data for the ambient temperature, and then the rest of them you're also just using the same as a static ratings. And dynamic for the dynamic line ratings uses real-time conditions for all those real-time data for all those environmental conditions, typically from field sensors, maybe some really advanced numerical models. Okay, and so the value of dynamic line ratings is well established. So, for instance, there's a Line Vision climate tech company that provides hardware and software solutions. Has found that it can reveal between 15 and 40% of additional capacity for that transmission line. And this allows transmission lines to operate closer to the true capacity while still being within a safe safety margin. It can help reduce the cost for additional infrastructure upgrades, reduce grid congestion, and facilitate better integration with renewable energy sources. And I think it's really fascinating. There's sort of this symbiotic relationship between wind energy and dynamic line rating. So as we'll find out, the wind speed also has a cooling effect on the dynamic line rating. And so as when the wind velocity is increasing, which is producing more energy from wind turbines, and the increased dynamic line rating can actually it has a higher line rating, and so that wind energy can then be moved onto the grid safely versus being curtailed. Okay, let's go down here. Okay, so the motivation to why I'm building Grid Vates. So there's lots and lots of research about improving the accuracy of these dynamic line rating forecasts. So as you'd probably guess, like time series modeling deep learning. There's some specialty software that already is out there. But I found that there was a gap in both academic research and practical tooling to help explain, understand, and educate about the relationship between the various weather forecasts, their uncertainty, and the impact they have on the resulting dynamic line rating. As I mentioned before, this is the dynamic line rating is based off of an IEEE, so it's a 738 2006. It's a first principle based equation, but it's pretty complex and it doesn't seem very intuitive to me. So so many of the reports and the articles that I read, they would kind of throw these very very generalized statements about these weather forecasts. And I even said to myself, like, okay, you have extra cooling, that's going to increase your dynamic line rating. You have more wind speed, it's going to increase your dynamic line rating. But like, what is the relationship between those two? Like, if I have a 5% decrease in temperature compared to a 5% increase in wind speed, like or decrease in wind speed, like how do those relate? And I wanted to build something that can help build some intuition about these different weather forecasts and the impact on the line rating. So the educational kind of philosophies that I have in Grid Vates, so there's some content-based learning, some experiential learning, and then some knowledge checks. Really, it's the core of it's really the experiential learning. There was Ripen ETL 2021 had this approach of grok it and use it, which is this philosophy that emphasizes the idea of understanding a topic thoroughly, intuitively by trying in practice. And so I wanted to make something that's just extremely hands-on, and has a lot of freeboard and knobs for the user to play with. Okay, so we'll go to the demo. So I used Streamlit, which is a Python-based web framework. So here is the landing page. So you can see here, it's just a quick introduction. Oh, and I also forgot to mention, so Vates, so that's a Latin term used to refer to a prophet, seer, poet, someone used to believe they possess the ability to predict the future. And the goal of this web app is to transform you into a DLR Vates. So here we have just a very brief description about each of the three tabs. So the benefits of DLR, the weather sensitivity, and then the weather scenarios, contact information, just a little bit for fun, talking about, a painting of what the original Grid Vates himself looked like. It's kind of a joke. I just used DALL-E, but I thought it was pretty cool that DALL-E came up in kind of what I would imagine one would look like. Okay, so jumping to the benefits of dynamic line rating tab, I'm not going to go through this in detail because a lot of it is what I already covered in the background for this presentation. But we're talking about what are dynamic line ratings, what are the benefits, and how they're calculated. Now we'll jump to the weather sensitivity tab. So this is definitely the core of the app. And we have, you can see, so we have some description of what's going on. And so essentially, okay, I'll just do an overview quick. So here we have the DLR forecast, and then we have each of the 4 environmental conditions also have a similar visual, and there's a bunch of knobs on the left. And so this is a 2D histogram. So we have time on the x-axis. It's 5 days at an hourly granularity. And then, so sort of on the y-axis, would be a histogram, right? So the sum of the probabilities in any at any vertical y line equal 1. And then so those probabilities are color scaled based on the value. And there's 2 sets of knobs that the user can modify here. So the first one is the temporal decay, and the second is the initial distribution parameters. So what's going on under the hood here, actually for this whole website, this whole page is just is a whole bunch of Monte Carlo simulations. So let's take temperature for example. So you have at t equals 0, there's an initial, there's a thousand random samples are drawn from the initial distribution. That initial distribution is set by, right. So it's this temperature is the mean value and the standard deviation is right on this slider. Now, for each of these weather conditions, there is an initial distribution. So for temperature, it's normal. And then there's an end state distribution. And the end state distribution for temperature, it's actually, so I grabbed the first and 99th percentile of that initial distribution, and then it's uniformly distributed. The uniform distribution of the first and 99th percentiles of the initial distribution. And what's happening here with this time scale is every step it's becoming slightly more it's transitioning from the initial distribution to that final end state distribution. And so for every time step n, it's it's n% of the initial distribution, or the final of the initial distribution, also times the temporal decay, is they're being aggregated together. Yeah, so if you have a temporal decay of 1.0, that's going to completely linearly transition from your initial distribution to your end state distribution. If you have a temporal decay of 0, that's going to persist that initial distribution through the whole time scale. And so 50% is obviously, it's going to go from the initial distribution. That end state distribution is going to be 50% of that uniform distribution. Yeah, there's. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. So temperature goes from uniform to sort of from normal to the uniform defined by the first and 99th percentile. Solar radiance is a little bit different, right? So because of the solar radiance, so the heat from the sun is pretty deterministic. So based on the sphere, the Earth, and the orbital patterns, you can calculate that. But cloud cover isn't, right? So cloud cover impacts this solar radiance. So that's why you see a different in this visualization, you see different values, because it's actually depending on the cloud cover. If it's completely sunny, it's going to be actually a really discrete sort of finite set of values. But as you if that's the case, as you move into the future, there's uncertainty whether that actually is going to be completely sunny or cloudy. Wind velocity, that is also going, so it's going from normal to uniform. And then wind direction. So yeah, I was really excited about this distribution. So it's the von Mises, which is it's a circular normal distribution. So this is important because you want it to be radial, and you want those values to be in a circular fashion. Okay, so all that, you can expand. And one other thing to note, you can expand these visuals. If you want them a little bit larger, you can expand and contract them. So let's just take one. Okay, so this is the default configuration. So this is the line rating for the 5 days. Let's just take wind velocity, and let's modify that real quick from the default values. Okay, so here we have a moderate wind velocity, moderate certainty in the initial distribution, and then but at 100% temporal decay. So let's make it not decay, a really high wind velocity, and a really tight initial distribution. And so we can see here how that changes the DLR forecast. And it's going to take a second to run. Okay. Cool. All right. so you can see that the average sort of line rating increased, and it also became much more tight because of that. Because we, that initial standard deviation being dropped, and that is also persisting, through the 5-day forecast. So, there's lots of different knobs that you can and so so that was the DLR forecast. Here's the wind velocity, right? So you can see, if you remember before, this is just, bands becoming a lot tighter. So you can go through and you can modify, all these different parameters and look at how it affects the line rating. Okay, let's transition to the last tab, which is the knowledge check. And so here we have 4 different rating profiles, and the user is prompted to match each of those profiles with the set of environmental conditions below. So it's a little bit tricky, but if you kind of look at these 4 different groupings of conditions holistically, you should be able to figure it out. So the first one is cool temperature, moderate wind velocity, inconsistent wind angle from 30 to 60 degrees. That's the giveaway right there. So the inconsistent wind angle is going to drive fluctuations in the line rating, which should lead the user to profile 2. So expand it, it's bolded, a little description. Now the next one is moderate. So it's the same temperature, same sort of qualitative temperature, qualitative wind velocity, but it's a consistent wind angle, 45 degrees. So that should be roughly the same average values of profile 2. You just have a lot less variability. Now these last 2, so you have cool temperature, low wind velocity, and hot temperature, high wind velocity. And then, so the consistent wind angle of 45 degrees. And so you're left with this profile 1 and profile 4. And so what you have to try and figure out, so everything else is considered because it's constant. So you have to figure out which would lead to a higher rating, a cool temperature and a low wind velocity, or a hot temperature and a high wind velocity. And actually, the answer is that, even if, these are qualitative, right? But if you have at a hot temperature, if you have a really high wind velocity, you still have a higher line rating, and at a cool temperature but a low wind velocity, you have a lower rating. Great. And then, just a reference section, obviously, for citations. Jumping back to my slides. So to wrap it up, some future work, as you can see, that runtime of the sensitivity tab was pretty long. So, there's a few different options here. Can go back and look at vectorizing the code. One thing that's interesting with Streamlit is it's actually, it's just running your scripts, your whole script. So if you make an adjustment to, say, the wind velocity, it's actually still calculating all the different Monte Carlo simulations for the whole page. So that's a little bit of a downside. I mean, I've actually loved Streamlit. It was my first time really working with it. I would highly recommend it for any sort of scientific-based web app like this. So, but that's one of the downsides. Maybe I can vectorize the data. There is some sort of caching function that I would need to explore. And if you saw, I was actually running that locally. It is hosted, so you can also host for free. But I also found sort of inconsistent. The servers seem to be inconsistent with their run times as well, which just sort of worsened the problem. Then 2 other things. So I want to add, so I have that temporal decay, right? So it's linear, going from the initial distribution to the end state distribution. I would like to add a logarithmic decay. If I had to, there's, your forecast certainty, it's not going to be linear, right? This is a good first step, but you're probably going to be much more certain for, the next time steps close to t equals 0. Then you're going to have some sort of reduction in certainty that's going to have, but it's going to plateau. And I think that would be cool to add in, so that logarithmic decay. And then lastly, quantitative metrics, right? So this is a very qualitative, web app. Like if you go back to, we're looking at the various, looking at the various ratings here. What would be nice is if I had even just, the average rating, and then some sort of, the confidence interval width, or something like that, that you could that the user could not just see what, based on the heat map, but could also quantify the differences based on the different configurations. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and yeah, please feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, concerns, or recommendations.